We do feel immensely pleased that the Honourable Paul Keating, former Treasurer and Prime Minister of this country, has agreed to launch this book. It's not just because it's about him. I know that Mr Keating gets asked to launch many books and he usually says no, for very good reasons, because they're not published by us. But this is a book about an era in Australian public life which turned out to be tremendously important, but it was also an era that was thwarted to some extent by what happened in 1996. And the subject of that era and its significance is dealt with in this book by David Love. And I'd like to welcome Paul Keating to launch Unfinished Business. Thank you.
Well, thank you indeed, Henry and David. Ladies and gentlemen, well, this was a book a long time in the making. In fact, I never thought it would ever be made, and it turned out, after I'd read it only recently, that David had actually interviewed me in 1996, the year that I lost with the Labor Party the general election. When I saw the manuscript, well, the first pull, if you like, of the book, as I read through it, I could see the threads that David had picked up all the way through, but in the meantime we'd had the 97-98 Asian financial crisis. We'd seen some substantial changes in the economy. We'd seen a long period of growth. Of course, we'd seen superannuation, which he mentions here solidly. We'd seen the superannuation guarantee charge come up to finish at 9% by 2001. By 2007, David would have seen the numbers tick over as we crossed $1 trillion in super. That was not there in 1996. So lots of things changed in the 10 years between 1996 and 2007, 11 years. It's a very interesting snapshot. But these are some of the reasons why it is a very important book. Now, not all books are important, and not all books about me are important. I can tell you that. And it may be true, and certainly is in this case, that a smaller book has done a better job of working out what I was about than perhaps a more voluminous book might have done, if you know what I mean. So, and the other reason the book is important, and probably the principal reason the book is important, it's written by a commentator from the age of hopelessness. This is when we were in the age of incrementalism, the days when there was no changes in economic policy. The place was run by the mandarins, and things just shifted without any political authority. They could only therefore shift incrementally. And I mentioned in one of the interviews Fred Wheeler and Arthur Tang and these people meeting at the Commonwealth Club on a Friday evening to work out, you know, in a sense, you show me your little incremental change and I'll show you mine. You know, that's what it really boiled down to. And so at the time when the terms of trade really turned sour for Australia, they've since turned wonderfully well, but when they turned sour in their long secular decline, was about the time Menzies retired in 1965. That's when the structural changes should have really been taking place. In fact, they didn't take place till Bob Hawke and I and that government turned up nearly 20 years later. But at that stage, David would have been in his 30s at the time of Menzies' retirement. He would have been in his prime. And of course, he put together this, later in his life, this influential commentary paper called Syntech. And if you were anyone in corporate Australia through the 1970s and into the 1980s, then you would have found that Syntech was the only authoritative, outside of the commentary you get in the Financial Review, in terms of you know, things like swaps and prices on the forward exchange markets and things like that. Syntec was really the only paper that covered them. And so David with his friend Alan Wood, who was his partner in the business, David principally was the commentator from the age of incrementalism, from the age of hopelessness. And that's why this book is important, because it takes you through the way things were, the completely hopeless state in the way things were in economic policy and to what it is today. Now, younger journalists have written competently about the period. Paul Kelly just walked in and there's this great text, The Age of Certainty. And these are very informative works and important parts of the history. But David's work today has got a wholly different slant. He was a young man when the terms of trade started to slide, when the structural joy for Australia started to end in the middle 60s. And he's gone on to talk about the changes since. Now, I remember well when the Reserve Bank was just a bond-selling agent of the Treasury. You know, the Treasury determined monetary policy, it wasn't the Reserve Bank. And even though the Reserve Bank had a prudential role in supervising banks and issuing the currency and all the rest, in policy terms, it was a completely subordinate organisation to the Treasury and to the official family. And of course, the exchange rate was set not on a quantity basis, but on a price basis. And of course, in those days, if you set it, if the central bank buys all the foreign exchange, the central bank has to issue all the local currency to the domestic money market, the domestic money supply, and of course that used to pump along the money base and with it inflation. So he starts out, calls the ancien regime, you know, what it was like in the old days. And in the book, some might say this is a product of his age. He talks about Everton, the split. And you'd say, well, who would today be talking about Everton, the split? But if you want to talk about me in those days, Everton, the split is important. Because, you see, and he says, if my family had been a Victorian family, we may well have been in the DLP. Well, I'd like to think we wouldn't have, David, but I mean, you've got to draw the line somewhere. But I mean, even if you had to put up with Bill Hartley and those other maniacs that ran the show. But the point that has to be understood is, though, that is, after the first great period of growth in the 20th century, 1904 to 1929, from 1929 to 1947, there was no growth. 1929 to 1947. Apart from the Second World War, there was no growth based on private investment. And that's a generally true statement about the Western world. And so therefore, when we get back to some sort of period of peace after the Second World War, was there any wonder there was a contest of ideas about whether centrally planned economies with egalitarian concepts were superior than robber baron economies of the kind which had brought the 1929 collapse on. And so there was no settlement of these issues. You know, half the Labor Party believed in central planning, and they still believed into it really until I turned up. And probably today some still believe in it. I mean, there are fossils still out there. And the fact is that so you go into the 1950s, which is the period I grew up in, not politically but as a kid, then there was no settlement of these issues, and in the 60s not either, because the 60s party, which was a contest between Caldwell and Whitlam in the Labor Party, Gough had no real interest in economic matters, and Corwell and co understood you needed a private economy. They didn't think the party had any ability to run a centrally planned economy, but that's about as far as it went. And of course, after the split, after Evatt, the Victorian Labor Party believed in central planning, etc. The New South Wales Labor Party didn't, and there was a great contest for ideas. So to write about those things in the book is important. You know, you get an idea of where I'm coming from in this show. David has gone to lengths to try and tell the story of what influenced my thinking about why the old Australian defence model, which was, you know, high terms of trade, paying for high levels of protection afforded by arbitrarily set wages, why we went around on that triangle for all those years until, of course, the first leg of the triangle broke down. And in it, of course, he lifts the lid on the sort of the silent conspiracy. He says that he talks about I'll quote him: the subjugation of Australian households to meet the needs of an established combination. The export industries, the overly protected, tariff-protected manufacturing industries, and the overly protected unions. So you had this, all these influences had a chop at the cherry. The people that didn't get a chop at the cherry were ordinary working people. And he says the essence of his mission, meaning mine, in those first 6 years as Treasurer, was to ease this ancient burden on ordinary working class and middle income families, households. And he gives an instance like narrowing the domestic bank margins on housing. He says represented a major transfer of income from banks to households. And you can see also on the tariffs. And he talks about the levels of tariff protections which obtained at the time, you know. When I became Treasurer, the effective rate of protection on a car was 96%, and now it's about 4%. So a Hyundai Getz you can get out there now for $16,000 or 17, would have been 30,000 so or more, and ditto for all the other cars, which meant that Australian working people, their standard of living was going down while they were paying these inordinately high prices for protection of the motor vehicle industry, and of course the protection of all sorts of industries, and of course most especially the banking industry, which had the biggest scam of all running. But we always had these groups, and you know, people like Menzies and others were smart enough to keep that ball in play. So they'd pick up a few people out of the Labor movement they liked if you were safe and decent, you know, weren't a pedophile or something. You might be appointed a Vice President of the Arbitration Commission. Might, you know. And that was your place in the sun, you know. And so there was this thing, but the great mass of the people, of course, were completely robbed in this period. And of course, on the company side, those great men of business, like you see now, you know, Howard and Costello, had been taxing dividends twice forever. You know, Howard was Treasurer for 7 years before he ever became Opposition Leader, then Prime Minister. He was taxing dividends twice all his life. And so was Meng the Merciless, you know. And the end result is they kept, a private company was able to keep 22 cents out of $1 in retained earnings. I changed that from 22 to 64, trebled it, trebled the retention in private companies, because I knew that if we'd built a society, or tried to build a society, where we in a way penally taxed the dynamic production of income in a company, yet we were letting capital gains go scot-free, we would end up with a kind of low rent show we had all through the 70s and into the 1980s. And David then goes on to mention the positive effects and changes in equity and capital markets, and he knows and would know, because Syntec used to write about those markets in the age of hopelessness, you know, when nothing happened, in the age of incrementalism. And so therefore, watching these things change, this is why his journalism in this case, or his commentary in this case, is a commentary of someone the unlikely commentary of someone who's looking at this thing much earlier than his contemporary colleagues today. Like, for instance, he understands perfectly the link between dividend imputation and the superannuation system. And even today, very few journalists, even financial journalists, fail to understand the link between the dividend imputation system and the superannuation system and the promotion of domestic equities and the turbocharging of our capital markets. He goes on to call Bill Kelty and me the odd couple, and of course we were an odd couple, but let me correct that. We are an odd couple. I'm still with him. The little general, affectionately known in the unions, but he was the most important trade unionist of the 20th century, without any shadow of a doubt. No one had his common sense, no one had his economic sense, and no one had his courage. And without him, many of these things I'm talking about, I would not able to do. The financial ones, yes, but the ones about wages, the new wages system, super, no. The movement to 3% universal superannuation was a great challenge for him and me, and we did it industrially. I could never get the Cabinet to agree to do it legislatively, and I said to Bill, if you get to 60% coverage industrially, then I will legislate the rest to bring the other 40% who have not had the industrial capacity to get it, to bring them up to 3%. And then finally I brought them up to 9% with the superannuation guarantee charge. He's got very interesting interviews in the book about these subjects with Jerry Noonan, who's here today, who he's interviewed as chairman of the Journalist Industry Fund, and Mike Delaney from the MTAA, just case stories about the influence and the positive good of the movement to occupational superannuation and the role of the industry funds in providing benefits for members, but also in playing a bigger role in the economy. He talks about and explains Howard and Costello's fundamental prejudice, as he calls it, against occupational superannuation and the development of industry funds. And they did have a fundamental prejudice. They did not want workers managing money. Simple as that. And they're only interested in superannuation as a top-end thing for people in the public service and people at the top end of business. They were never interested in universality, and that's why they left the SGC jammed at 9%, where it remains today. He lays out, as few authors have, a few important things about Howard, which I think are worth repeating. Howard also enjoyed a charmed life when it came to the historical record of his tenure as Treasurer. While failing to give Hewson the backing he so needed for the Campbell report, by the way, I'm not sure Hewson was as powerful in that as Professor John Rose, but I'll leave that for another historian to do, because Rose was the one who saw me about backing Campbell. He said, Howard, simultaneously presided over an economic mess. Business interest rates reached 21%, but to no avail in terms of economic governance. That's the point. Not the level, but to no avail in terms of economic governance. In 1981, wages grew by 16%, leading to a recession marked by a combination of stagnant growth and high inflation. By the time Howard had handed over the economy to Labor in 1983, the economy was growing at only 1.4%. The unemployment rate was 11% and inflation had reached 11%. Paul Keating's comments in later years was fair enough. We went into Howard's recession with double-digit inflation and we came out with double-digit inflation. Whereas from my time, in the so-called recession we had to have, we went into it with inflation at about 7% and we came out with inflation at 1%. As a consequence, we had the decade of the 1990s and beyond with continuous low inflationary growth. Now, all of that's completely true. The guy that missed the great opportunity in those years, the Fraser years, it was of course Howard. But he got out of it. And then because of the Howard-Peacock succession, and it went on and on and on, finally, after the collapse of Downer, he becomes opposition leader and then picks up the new made economy, free, gratis and for nothing. But any society with any self-regard would have drummed him out of public life after the 1980s, his early 1980s performance. This guy tried his wages experiment on in 1981 and gave us 16% wages growth and 11% inflation. The very same thing he tried on this time, except this time with his wages system. It was built on my wages system, enterprise bargaining, and the safety net after I moved out of centralised wage fixing, you know. And that's why his movement with work choices, of course the Tories wrote it up as taking the inevitable change Keating began. Keating didn't begin the wages change, Keating started it, went through it and finished it. Complete. We didn't need work choices. Work choices is just a nasty, bitchy piece of legislation to knock off the income of the low paid. But when he tried it with centralised wage fixing in 1981, of course, he was like the boy in the powder keg, you know. He's in there, there's all the TNT around him, he lights up the match, where am I? Boom! We soon worked out where he was. But it's worth recording, as David does here, just how much he got away with. Then he talks about the role of the float in beating the hedge funds off in 97, 98. You remember all the pruning Peter Costello did about, oh, we came through the crisis in 97, 98. Really mean the mere fact that I'm there as Treasurer meant that all those nasty hedge funds all took fright and ran away. Well, what happened was, of course, with the float, the central bank was no longer there to be played against, as it was in other periods. And when you had these runs by hedge funds or money market funds against a country, as you saw, you know, with George Soros and the English pound, you had it when you had a system of managed valuations. When I floated the exchange rate, I removed all exchange controls, so the exchange rate was truly floating. It was a quantity-based system. The price of the money, the price of the exchange rate was set by the quantity of buying versus the quantity of selling versus the potential of the quantity of buying. It was no longer a price-based system. And so therefore, if hedge funds wanted to speculate, they weren't speculating against the central bank, they were speculating against other private people. And then David correctly talks about the depths of the Australian foreign forex market, foreign investment market. And he mentions as a prop in this book, Macquarie Bank, as an example of an outfit which grew out of the financial freedoms that had been introduced during my years and the depths of the Australian foreign exchange market. And that market's depth meant that when the hedge funds took us on, after they'd flattened Thailand, flattened Indonesia and flattened Korea, they ran into trouble here and went away with their tails between their legs, because in the end they didn't know whether they would have to cover their short positions at a higher exchange rate. So, of course, you know, the pruning went on, and of course in those days nobody in the Labor Party in 97 or 8 would stand up for the structural changes which I and Bob Hawke and our colleagues had introduced. So as a consequence, Costello got away with this argument, oh, we were able to take the economy, as if that nong was able to take the economy anywhere, let alone through a crisis of this kind, without the structural, the flexibility in the economy helping him.